it's John and Casey here from Are You Real? And we've been sleeping on my pillow now for over a month. And I'm telling you, our sleep has improved drastically. So what are you waiting for? When are you going to jump on board and start experiencing the kind of restorative sleep you need in your life? Are you waiting for a better offer? Well, your wait is over, because if you go to mypillow.com right now, you can take advantage of the MyPillow 4-pack offer, right, John?
That's right. You get 2 premium MyPillows and 2 to-go anywhere pillows at half off. Just go to mypillow.com, use my code REAL, and get 50% off. Go to mypillow.com, click on the 4-pack special, and enter promo code REAL, or call 1-800-943-4615. But don't forget, you got to use promo code REAL.
Welcome to Are You Real? Finding the Authentic You, the podcast that focuses on Christians that are active in everyday life. Join in as we speak to everyone from successful business owners to educators to athletes about their faith and how it helps them reach out and revolutionize those around them to do the same. And now, get ready to roar with your host, the voice of manifestation, John Fuller.
Hey, Roar Nation, John Fuller here, and I am fired up for today's interview. I got something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about burnout and all kinds of different stuff. So I'm excited about that because I think over the last couple years, I have suffered from several of these things. And our guest, Carey Nieuwhof, is going to help me. Carey, you fired up and ready to do this thing?
Well, I am now, but I wasn't when I was burned out. I can tell you that much. I'm ready to go, John. Totally.
I guarantee it. All right. So, Roar Nation, Carey is a former lawyer and founding pastor of Connexus Church in Barrie, Ontario. He's one of the most influential churches in North America. He's a sought-after speaker, podcaster, which we love podcasters, and thought leader. He's regularly appearing at major U.S. conferences and events such as Orange, Exponential, Rethink Leadership, and Lifeway Leadership. He and his wife, Tony, reside near Barrie, Ontario, and have 2 children. All right, man, that tells us nothing of so much about you. So why don't you give us a from the top view of who you are and what you do, Carey?
Yeah, well, I never ever thought I'd be in ministry, that's for sure. From the time I was 8 years old, John, I wanted to be a lawyer. And I don't know, what makes an 8-year-old want to be a lawyer, but all that was wrong with me when I was 8. Got into the law school of my dreams. I did radio along the way. So I did radio in my hometown. When I was 16, I walked in, I said, hire me. That's probably the entrepreneurial thing God gave me. And then, I did that in Toronto as well, got a job in Toronto radio, but kind of realized back then you were washed up at 40 in radio. And I knew that. Now everybody in broadcasting is 50, 55 years old. But back then it was a young person's game. So, if you were in your 20s, you were on top of the world. By 40, you were yesterday's news. So I thought, well, there's not much of a future in that. And ended up still going to law school. It's I always wanted to be a lawyer. I'll go to law school. And got into the law school of my dreams. And in between first and second year law, felt a call into ministry. It was the most surprising thing in the world because I don't really have any of the gifts. This is a podcast about finding your purpose and what does that mean. And I kind of knew I had the gifts for law, but I did not have the gift set for ministry. So it was really, really confusing to me. Finished law, worked for a year in downtown Toronto as a student, and then got called to the bar, got qualified in the whole deal, and then went straight off into seminary. And ended up in the middle of seminary, I thought, gosh, I've been in school a long time. I was pushing my late 20s by then because I did history, and then I did law, and got qualified as a lawyer, and then went into seminary. So I went up north of Toronto 23 years ago to these little tiny dying mainline churches with average attendances of 6, 14, and 23. That was the mega church. I would do the circuit on Sunday. And long story short, I'm still here 23 years later. So it's not 6 and 12 or 14 and 23 anymore. We have about 1,500 people on the weekend, 3 locations, and about 5,000 people who watch us online every week. So we're very grateful for the journey. I'm really surprised at where it's taken me into speaking and writing and podcasting and helping leaders and helping people thrive in life and leadership. But I think it was Joe Walsh who said, have you ever seen that documentary of the Eagles? It's the long one on Netflix. It's pretty good. It's a good watch. And Joe Walsh has, I think, 5 brain cells left. He was pretty hard on himself with drugs in the 70s and 80s. I understand he's been clean and sober for a while now. But he said something really interesting. He said, when you look at the time, at different moments in your life, everything seems like it's really confused and twisted and like it's completely random. But looking back on it, it looks like a beautifully constructed poem. I think he's right, because what I need right now at this point in my life, God kind of gave me through that really weird, circuitous path of like, what makes a 16-year-old walk into a radio station and go, hey, man, hire me. And then they do. And then my year in law, I spent a year almost every day in court. And boy, you get good on your feet fast when you're in court every day up against lawyers who are 10, 15 years older than you. And so I learned a lot of communication skills. I learned a lot of analytical skills in those early years that I'm still using today, not only for ministry, but for writing books and podcasting and helping leaders. So it's been a fun journey.
This sounds like a really fun journey. So let's back up, 20, 30 years to law. When you felt the call to ministry, I'm just curious, how did you make that transition, or what did that look like? So did you know you were or you were just kind of playing with the idea?
It came out of the blue. I was going to be a lawyer. Like, I was a Christian, so raised in a Christian home, gave my life to Christ as a teenager 682 times. It was one of those, every time I sinned, I
got saved every Sunday.
Exactly.
Yeah, I went to the altar every Sunday to repent for what I did Friday and Saturday night.
Bingo. Yeah, that was my life. And there was a lot to repent of. Yeah. But, late teens, early 20s kind of drifted away. Never really walked away, but, I was right on the border. And then 21, 22, I kind of woke up and said, okay, as far as my spiritual journey goes, I got to either follow Jesus or forget about it. Like, I can't pretend anymore. Yeah. Started reading my Bible, praying every day. I said I'd do it for 6 months and make up my mind. Didn't take 6 months, recommitted my life to Christ. But I was still going to be a lawyer, right? Like, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you have to go into ministry. Right. And I'd honestly never thought about it. I thought about going into teaching. I thought about going into law. I thought about broadcasting, radio. I had all kinds of careers that I had as a backup in case law didn't work out. But I got into the law school of my dreams. And then, the big question for those of us who are Christians in law school was, how do you actually practice law ethically? Because, it has a reputation and the whole deal. So, I thought, well, there's a really good firm that I know, and I got a job there for my first summer between first and second year law. It was in my hometown. And so I practiced law there, as a student, really, for the summer. And I really enjoyed it. It was going well. They offered me a job. They said, hey, when you're finished Osgood, come and look us up. We'll hire you back. So my life was kind of set. And then one afternoon, I don't come from a charismatic tradition. And I just had the supernatural experience where I had a vision of myself at 20 years in advance. I was 44. So I think I was 24 at the time. I was 44 years old. And I was very successful professionally, but morally bankrupt. Like, wife was gone, kids were gone, all the money in the world, the house, the fame, the recognition. But like inside, I was just a shell. And I don't know why I knew it in that moment. I was wide awake. It was like a daydream. It was like a vision. It was just in an instant it happened. I saw it and I knew, okay, this is from God. I think this is from God. And then I didn't know what it meant, but I knew this. I knew that law wasn't for me. And as I walked out of the office that day, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do law. Then I left that lawyer's office that I was working in the afternoon. I went to the library of the firm, the boardroom, and I'm kind of looking out this big bay window in my hometown, trying to figure out, well, what does this mean if I'm not going to practice law? Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my life? God, is that actually you? And I heard this prompting. And again, I'm not somebody who like wakes up every day and, the Lord told me to eat Wheaties. Like that is not my background. I'm like, I read the Bible, I prayed, I'm going to do the best thing I know how to do. That's still how I conduct my life. But I'm praying at that moment, like, God, give me some direction and insight because I'm lost. And I'm looking down First Street from the law firm, and I see my home church, the church that I grew up in. But the only part of the church you can really see from the angle that I was at in the law firm, in the boardroom, was the pastor's study. Like, I knew the church well enough to know, oh, those are the office windows. And I felt this prompting. It wasn't an audible voice, but it was definitely a voice that said, you need to be in there. And I'm like, what? Ministry? Weirdest thing in the world. I finished law 5:00 at the office that day. I went to pick up my soon-to-be fiance. We were going back to my parents for dinner. And I didn't tell her a word. I didn't say anything. And we're driving to my parents' place. She looks at me and she goes, have you ever thought about going into ministry? Yeah, exactly. I'm like, you'll never believe what happened to me at the office today. So that was a crazy period in my life. And I was really confused. But my Reformed background took me to the place where I pretty quickly realized, okay, your call has to be confirmed in the people around you, right? If you're the only person who thinks you're called, maybe you're not called, right? Yeah. There's lots of people. It's like, I know God is calling me. Well, nobody else seems to think so. So I didn't want to be that guy. And I just started talking about it that day. We processed it with my parents. I ran it by some spiritual mentors in the church. I took it back to some of my college buddies and said, guys, you'll never believe what happened to me this summer. And they're like, oh, yeah, totally. And none of them were Christians. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So it kept getting confirmed and confirmed and confirmed. And that moved me into seminary. But it was a total, like, just chaos and confusion once I got into seminary, because I thought, I don't belong here and I don't have any gifts. So I don't know what to do with this, but here I am.
So real quick, I want to back up just a little bit, because I think a lot of times we feel we're in one thing. So you're a lawyer, and then we feel called to do something else, which I think is a great place to be. My curiosity, though, is how did you make that transition? At what point? Because that's a big jump. I mean, in my mind, in a logical mind, I'm going to think, for most people, I would say, man, I just spent $100,000 or hundreds of thousands of dollars on education. I have years invested in this. I have all these things. It doesn't make sense in my logical mind to make this jump. And the one thing I like that you did say is you talked to people and you got more confirmation. But where did you make the hurdle and the jump? Because that's a big deal, because you have a lot invested in what you're doing or what you were doing at the time.
I had a ton invested. And fortunately for me, I worked through law school. Also, my fiance was a pharmacist, so she made decent money. And between the two of us, we actually ended up getting married we got married in law school. So we were able to come out of law school almost debt-free, which was a miracle.
That's a big deal.
Which was great, yeah. But you're right. I had 5 years of my life totally invested in it. One of the decisions I made, John, was I decided, and I was ready to go into seminary right away. And then I had a couple of people in my life, particularly my dad, who said, finish what you start. Told you that since you were 3 years old. Finish what you start. So I thought, okay, I'm going to finish it. So glad I did. Like, right through to writing the bar admission course, I did all the exams, which are brutal. And I got them done. I passed. I went to the ceremony. They made me a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada, and then I resigned. And, I did the year in downtown Toronto. And here's why I did the year in downtown Toronto, because I knew one of the biggest criticisms of pastors is you've never actually done anything with your life. You haven't earned a paycheck other than, maybe you waited on tables for a year while you were in high school or something. And I thought, no, I'm going to go into the business world, downtown Toronto, in the office towers, and I am going to learn what it's like to earn a paycheck for 365 days. That shows up all over my latest book. It's like, I learned so much in that year. I just took really good notes. And I'm so glad I followed that, followed through on that, because I feel like I use my law all the time. That was by far, I have 3 degrees, one in history, one in theology, and one in law. That was the toughest degree. Like I went from a straight A student when I graduated undergrad down to like B's and C's and a couple of random A's in first year law. It was just an intellectual drubbing. And so it retrained my brain It really made me think analytically in a very different way. And then the practice of law, too, was a lot of fun because they sent me to court every day, which is what I wanted to do. And man, talk about like learning on your feet in front of judges who really don't have a lot of empathy or patience for people who aren't well prepared. I'm using all of that stuff moving forward. And then I just went into seminary. I thought, okay, I finished that well. So as to the transition, I just went to seminary out of obedience. It's like, okay, here I am. I have no idea what this means. Now what? Yeah. I really didn't know. It's like I'm supposed to be here. But I feel like I closed that chapter well. The challenge was I had already done law was 5, and then undergrad was 3 or 4. Oh my gosh, I'd done like 9 years of post-secondary already. It was crazy.
I'm writing this down. I like what you just said right now. You said you closed that chapter well. And I think there's a lot of significance in that. I don't even know if you meant to say that, but I think people need to hear that because a lot of times I think we feel called. I can't tell you how many times, especially in the business world, I hear somebody say, you know, I hate my job, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. And they just get up and they leave. And in other terms, they burn that bridge. And it's foolish. Because especially in the business world, you know, you could go into something entirely different, but, you know, it could be 10 years down the road, you run into those people and they made that transition, or you have to go sell those people something because of the business. You never know.
Oh, I'll tell you, that is a great lesson, John. And honestly, being in the same community for 23 years, I mean, even on the ministry side, I just want to underscore what you just said. People have come and gone from our church over the years. Like our story has been net growth, but you know how that works. There's a back door, there's a front door. You just have to make sure your front door is bigger than your back door and that your back door isn't irresponsibly large, right? Like that's life. We're not a cult. You can leave, and people do leave. But if you stick around for 23 years, they come back.
Yeah.
And if you have burned bridges or you've talked about them negatively behind their back, or, you know, oh man, I'll tell you, it's, and I'm shocked. Some Sundays it's like, really, you're back? I thought we were the worst thing ever. And now you're back. I go, okay, all right. So yeah, the high road's not the easy road, but it's the best road.
Absolutely.
And plus, I look at it selfishly. What I learned in those 5 years in law, people used to ask me all the time. They would say, you know, especially in my first few years of ministry, so do you use your law, you know, now that you're in ministry? And at first my answer was no, because like I'm not reading contracts every day or suing people or, you know, ending up in court. But I think the answer now is, oh yeah, absolutely. I use it every day because it kicked my butt so hard. It completely retrained my mind and how I analyze problems, how I see leadership, how I tackle life really is done through the analytic framework of a lawyer. The other thing I would say to exiting well, I didn't go into ministry because I hated law. I loved law. Like I had all these plans and dreams and ambitions, and I was going to be in the Supreme Court by the age of 30, and I was going to get into constitutional law because it was academic. Like I had all these plans, and then God kind of went, I felt like, and so did others, that God went, nope. It's like, close that door, and here's a new one for you to walk through. So I just went into seminary really like, okay, this is not what I was going to do with my life, but I'm here trying to be obedient. So now what? But I felt like I had to die to like all these dreams and ambitions that maybe, you know what? I was going to say that I put in my heart.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I put those in my heart. I think God did, like he's sovereign, right? And I was there for 5 years for a very specific purpose, but I didn't know what it was at the time.
I want to hit on that for a second, Carey, is looking back. So a lot of times at that transition where you in your mind, you're thinking, I love doing what I'm doing, but I feel called to go into ministry. And you're having that kind of tug of war within your heart. I would think I would. But looking back, though, I would assume that you have no regrets. And I wanted you to hit on that point because I think sometimes people need that nudge and that encouragement to make that leap of faith, even when it doesn't make sense, because now you can look back and see all the things that God's done in your life. Had you not made that leap of faith, you know, you wouldn't be where you are today.
No, it's totally true. And it was a study in downward mobility. I mean, everything you learn about career and life from the marketplace is upward mobility, right? You got to, next year is more money, next year is more people, next year is more responsibility. And I remember I started working in a church, and it was my first, I'd volunteered for years, basically my whole life. And then I got my first paid job in a church in student ministry at a church in Toronto. And it was a fairly prosperous church. So a lot of the people who worked in the bank towers downtown would end up at that church on the weekend, which was, sort of a midtown church. So they put me in charge of their youth ministry. And I enjoyed doing that. I wasn't the best youth pastor, but I enjoyed doing it. And I remember the first day I got my paycheck, the treasurer of the church was somebody who worked as a financial planner in downtown Toronto. And he came over and he handed me, this was the day of, the era of paychecks. He handed me my paycheck and he said, I just want to apologize. He said, I know this used to be your hourly rate, but this is for the last 2 weeks. Here you go. God. Enjoy this. Enjoy this. He said, ministry doesn't pay what law pays. And it didn't. I mean, when I came up here, so that church went on really well. And I was trying to figure out, I'm sort of jumping ahead a couple of years. I'm trying to figure out in the middle of seminary, okay, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to teach? Like, am I going to be a professor? I went down to Princeton. They offered me a scholarship, the whole deal. I'm like, okay, maybe I'll get my doctorate and then I'll teach people how to preach because I'm a communicator, right? I was in radio. I did law in court, so maybe I can do that. But we really wanted to make sure that we were following God's will, not our will. And so there was the question of congregational ministry. So I had found out about these 3 churches, which I ended up going to. And long story short, I was at that time working at that church that handed me that tiny paycheck. And I said, hey, you know what? There's these 3 churches north of Toronto. I may be going there next year rather than staying here for the summer. I want to sort of explore being a senior pastor. I just want to give you guys a heads up that, I'm doing this. So their elders met and they came to me. This is a church in a very prosperous neighborhood in Toronto, very desirable neighborhood, ministering to the kind of people I thought I would be ministering to. Bankers, lawyers, those kinds of people in the finance industry. I thought, I get that world, given my background. So they came to me and they said, okay, we hear you might be going north. Here's a counter offer. They offered me almost what I would be making as a first-year lawyer in downtown Toronto. They said, within 5 years, you'll be the senior pastor of this church. I was 28, 29. Most people wait till they're 50 to be the senior pastor of that church, and you can take over. And I'm like, oh, my goodness. And then we ended up preaching up here, and then they wanted a choice. The church is up here north of Toronto. They wanted a choice, so they had me and a classmate do a preach-off, which was a really bad idea. I won by 1 vote, like literally 1 vote. So 49.9% of the congregation was against it.
It was an early version of American Idol.
It was. And I was almost sent home. And then they told me what I would be making. So $19,000 a year.
Oh man, you're killing it.
Plus a house. Yeah, living the life. And I was totally torn because I'm like, I didn't want it to be a financial decision. Right. Because it's like I had to give that up. And if I wanted to make money, I should stay in law. I could have been making 6 figures in a couple of years, the whole deal. And we didn't want to make ministry a financial decision. So, we really prayed about it. And once again, I got a handful of times in my life where I feel like God showed up supernaturally. But the guy who was leading the search up here called my house in Toronto, my apartment in Toronto. And I said, George, I don't know whether I can make a commitment. Like, I got this possibility in Toronto. You've offered me this. And he goes, oh, Carey, why don't you just come up to Oro, place I live, and help us? I'm like, George, just give me 3 days. Hung up the phone, short conversation. He was heartbroken. My wife, by that point, we're married. She says to me, well, now what do we do? I don't know. And she says, well, why don't we read the Bible? And I, just kind of arrogantly, I'm like, what do? You just open the Bible randomly and like pick some verse? Like, what do you do? Come on. And so my mind went to Acts chapter 16, where Paul had to make a decision about where to travel. Long story short, he decides to go to Macedonia because a man from Macedonia appeared in the middle of the night and said to Paul, why don't you just come to Macedonia and help us? I knew enough New Testament background to know that Macedonia was poor. And I knew enough about Oro to know that these were churches that were poor. Yeah. So we cried up here, and here we are 23 years later, and $19,000 a year. So yeah, it's not that anymore, fortunately. But you know what? I've found that almost every move I've made in my life has involved a pay cut, has involved downward mobility, risk, and God has been faithful every step of the way.
I think that's interesting. So obviously you took huge pay cuts each time, but I think God has very well blessed that over time in each area. So it's been significantly worth the investment, per se.
For sure. But, you know, the interesting thing about how I've experienced God working is he doesn't show you that in advance. No. You know, I stepped out of the lead pastor role here 3 years ago. We still had 2 kids in university, which, as you know, is extremely expensive. I insisted on a pay cut because I said I can't make more than the new lead pastor. Like if I'm the founding pastor and just teaching, I've got to have a pay cut. And my wife's like, well, here we are once again, jumping off a cliff. Let's see what happens. and once again, you know, I didn't know that my speaking would take off or that my books would sell or that, you know, my courses would do well. And so God has a way of providing. But I have discovered that he's saying, Carey, I need you to take the jump first. Are you ready to take the jump? And I think if you're willing to, and it's not a, hey, if you jump, it's going to work out 100%. But all I'm saying is I've lacked for nothing. And I have a lot of affection. My wife is a lawyer. She went on, she, you know, has practiced for years. But it's not a guarantee. But I've found the faithfulness of God is impossible to underestimate.
Man, amen to that. There's a lot of truth to that. Okay, so talking about taking the jump, I do want to jump into your book. A lot of times we're able to kind of dive in and out with some of my questions on your book, but I think you're going to actually hit, you know, one of my next questions that I usually ask is kind of that low spot in your life where you just can't get worse than this. And then God, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I'm holding your book actually in my hand right now. And from what I'm gathering, I feel like this book is a highlight of a lot of low points because you couldn't write this book without hitting some serious low points. So the book is called Didn't See It Coming. And overcoming the 7 greatest challenges that no one expects and everyone experiences. So why don't we dive into the journey of this book and hit some high points that you would like to talk about?
You know, what really surprised me, John, was everybody would expect, oh, yeah, in law, you're going to get burned out, cynical, the whole deal. Well, I was only in law for a year in the marketplace, you know, 5 total in training. Law didn't make me cynical. I was like super optimistic, idealistic, going to change the world. But after the first decade of ministry, by the time I hit 40, I was cynical. I completely burned out. I felt empty on the inside. And I'm like, how did serving God do this to me? And the biggest surprise in my life was, and we had a great church. I mean, we started with those little tiny churches, but you know, we became the fastest growing church in our denomination, one of the 3 largest. We, you know, people were driving from an hour away to come to our church. Lots of unchurched people were being saved. So things in ministry were going fantastic, but things on the inside of me as a leader were kind of falling apart. And as a person, and not in the headline sense that, you know, there was no affair, there was no scandal. It wasn't the stuff that gets you out of ministry. It was just the challenges in life, you know, as a subtitle of Didn't See It Coming says, that no one expects, but it seems like everyone experiences. And so it led me to the point where at 41, I was literally at the top of the world. I was at the top of my game. I had met some of the people at North Point Church, Andy Stanley's church. My friend Reggie Joyner introduced me to Andy. Andy and Reggie invited me to speak in 2006 at North Point. I gave my first keynote in front of a crowd of 2,500 people. Never had an audience that size before. And according to all accounts, I crushed it. It was a great talk. Even Andy was super encouraging after, you know, and my wife and kids were there in the front row. And we flew back to Toronto. And when I got off the plane, it's like I fell off a cliff. And I went from like the highest high to this deep, dark place within a matter of weeks. And that was burnout. And I had been burning the candle at both ends, pedal to the metal for a decade. I've learned a lot of stuff in the last 12 years since I burned out. But, when I was in my 30s, as we got more people, I thought the solution to that was more hours. More people is more hours. And because I was in ministry, more people, more hours equals more faithful. That's a terrible math and terrible theology, but I didn't know any better. And I sort of came to the end of my physical abilities. As Greg McKeown has written in his incredible book, Essentialism, I did not protect the asset. He talks about the asset being you, your body, your mind, your health. Did not do a good job of that. I was not living in a way today that would help me thrive tomorrow. And then also emotionally, I would say, looking back on it, probably emotionally and relationally, I was really burned out. Ministry's hard. Life's hard. Yeah. Forget it. I mean, if you're in business, it's hard, right? You hire staff, you think they're going to be with you forever, and then they leave. And then you're like, well, why would you leave? And so you hire some more people, and then they go, or you have to fire them, and you're on round 3 or 4, and you're going, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, this isn't fun. I didn't sign up for that. So I had a lot of that, some friendships that kind of tanked in the process. And at the end of the day, by the time I hit 40, I was just like low. And I'm not somebody who struggles with depression, but I was definitely, I would have met all the signs for clinical depression in the summer of 2006. And I was seeing a counselor, and we were going through some stuff, but like I kind of thought it was over. And so after a decade of ministry, everything on the outside looks amazing because we had people traveling literally from coast to coast to see our church. But on the inside, it was a mess. And again, without like, there wasn't an affair, there wasn't a porn addiction, like, I wasn't drinking too much. It wasn't those things you read about in the headlines. It was just like, wow, life is hard. And it just about took me out. So that's what the book's about.
I'm trying to block out. I use a co-space, my office. So we have people in here. I'm in a conference room. So we're sharing the mic with other people.
Understood.
I want to ask you this for people, and even myself, I've been there, but what does burnout look like? What are we looking for before we dive into some of the things you dealt with? I mean, what are some signs of that? As you talk about burning the candle at both ends, because we feel like we have to perform. And like you said, like people saw, you had this amazing, what should I say? The church is thriving. All these great things are happening, but you're dying on the inside.
Yeah.
What is that?
So a few signs to look for. One for me, for sure, and these are personal, but in talking to hundreds of other leaders, I think they're more than just personal. It's a little bit, there's some universality in these. That's what I'm trying to say. One big one, my passion was fading. I'm a pretty passionate person. I love getting up in the morning. I love tackling what's ahead. But one sure sign of burnout for me was my passion was gone. Like it wasn't just for ministry. It was like for nothing. I wasn't that passionate about family anymore. Even though I love my family, I wasn't that passionate about hobbies or rest or recreation. So that was a big thing. Another one, you no longer feel the highs or the lows. Like emotionally, what I've learned is you're supposed to experience joy and you're supposed to experience sorrow. God created us that way. When I was burning out, and in the years prior to burnout, the emotions kind of went from like these ups and downs, which are normal, not like bipolar or whatever, but just like normal, like, oh, that's amazing, or oh man, I'm so sad. That's normal. I just got flat. Like pretty much non-responsive. It was just like driving across the Great Plains or the prairies. It's like just flat. And then that was interspersed. The flatness was interspersed with inappropriate, disproportionate emotions. So, for example, something really minor, like someone left the fridge door open, meltdown. Boom. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. They left the fridge door open. It's not the end of the world, but you're the towel's on the floor. And you're like, whoa, that was an 11 when it's really a 2. Yeah, maybe it's an issue. You shouldn't leave the fridge door open, but you should handle it at a fridge door open level, not a nuclear meltdown. So that was a problem. Or it can be inappropriate the other way, that somebody says, hey, did you hear that so-and-so just died? And you're like, oh,
that sucks.
Yeah, exactly. Right. How about this one? Everybody drains you. Let's be honest, not everybody energizes you. There's always going to be draining people. But when everybody drains you, that is not a good sign. Another one, I got a whole section of the book devoted to cynicism, but just that you're becoming cynical. And cynicism snuffs out hope. You no longer believe the best. Number 6, and this is where, unfortunately for me, addictions weren't part of that. If I have an addiction, it would be to work and to food. That would be it. Because I'm a pastor. What am I going to do? Drugs? No. Drink too much? No. Sex? No. So I just work too much. I eat too much. But addictions happen because nothing satisfies you. It's I'm just not happy. The church can never be big enough. The staff can never work hard enough. Nothing gives you pleasure anymore. Another thing that really in the profound stages of burnout, you just can't think straight. It's that you're capable of a level of thinking that you just can't access anymore. An 8th sign would be your productivity is dropping. So you're putting in 8 or 10 hours, but you're doing nothing. Or, it takes you forever to empty your inbox, or you're just not producing at a level that you should be. Number 9, I've hinted at this, you're self-medicating. So you're taking to food or to drugs or to alcohol or to sex or to some form that isn't healthy to medicate your pain away. And a lot of people do that. Here's one that really hit me, and I realized this as soon as in my recovery, but I had stopped laughing. I realized in that summer of 2006, I probably didn't laugh once, even if something was funny, like a movie or a joke or whatever. And I remember in the beginning stages of recovery, listening to something. It was too early for podcasts. This is 2006, but probably on the radio. And I laughed out loud. And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't think I've laughed out loud in 6 months.
Yeah, what was that? Am I okay?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what was that? Just came out of my body, right? And then the other sign that I mentioned that I saw in myself is that sleep and time off no longer refuel you. So, if you have a bad day, you're like, okay, I got to get 8 hours sleep. But I had a lot of sleep and I wasn't doing it. I took a vacation and I felt worse at the end of my vacation than I did at the beginning. And that's a sign that something more fundamental is out of place. Now, I think it's normal at the pace of life that we live today to have one or two of those signs from time to time. If there were 10 or 11 that I outlined. If you're 11 for 11, that's time to go see a doctor and a Christian counselor right away. So those are the signs I've seen. And I remember my counselor said to me, he said, Carey, I want you to remember how this feels. He says, because you will recover. I don't know how he knew that. I'm so thankful he was right. He said, you will recover, but some people never do. And if you remember how dark it is right now, that will give you the ability to empathize with those who are there. He's right.
Yeah, that's really good. Man, you're hitting home. I went through that in my early 30s and had to learn stuff, but it's interesting. A lot of the things that you hit on, I feel like even lately I've had to go through, because sometimes I think we do burn the candle at both ends. And I just love being raw and real about stuff, especially for my audience, because we have multiple businesses. We do a podcast. And man, I got to tell you, there's sometimes I get to Friday and I'm just like, I don't think I can move. I'm just spent. And then, and then the even thought of having to go to church. I mean, we go to a great church and there's loving people and my wife does stuff there and they're great people. And I'm like, dude, if I even got to step into church right now and just smile at somebody, it feels overwhelming. So I say all that because I think a lot of us get to that place. like you talked about through your book, but what's the fix? So it's easy to relate and say, hey, great, I have these symptoms and I suck and life sucks. And you know what I'm saying? But there's a fix. And take me on some of that journey of you walking through that.
Well, there is no fix, John. I'm kidding.
Show's over, everybody. Go home.
Show's over, everybody. Fortunately there is. But you know what's challenging is for a lot of people, they just accept that as normal now. That's like, I'm just always going to be tired. I'm always going to be exhausted. And I realized by the grace of God for me, it was the summer of 2006. So the burnout started. I mean, I guess I'd been burning out for a year or two, but like when it became unsustainable, like I can't even work anymore. That was May of 2006. By the end of August, I was preaching again. I told my elder board about it. You know, all the people who needed to know knew that it was an issue. And I'm like, I got to get back into the saddle and just try this. And so I preached apparently a pretty good series. My elders came up and said, man, you're back. I'm like, well, maybe it felt like that to you, but it sure doesn't feel that way to me. So, but by September, I had started to get flickers of passion back where I would think about the mission of our church and I'm like, oh, that was good. And I had spent August of 2006 sleeping and crying. So this was part of my story. I don't think it's a universal thing, but I had, kept the pedal to the metal so hard that I think sleep is a little bit like money. You can pile up a deficit, but eventually your deficit becomes a debt if you don't pay it back. And eventually the debt needs to be paid off. So August, I feel like I paid my sleep debt back because I was just tired all the time. So I'd sleep 8 or 10 hours a night and then I'd nap 2 or 3 times during the day. And by the end of the month, I'm like, okay, I feel better. I feel like I've got an even keel. So there was that. I also cried a lot in August of 2006, which is really weird to talk about as a guy. I in my early 30s, I didn't want to go to counseling. I sent people to counseling. I was smarter than that, better than that. Not
you have
true.
a law degree. Who needs counseling, right?
Who needs counseling? Who needs empathy? I mean, that's for weak people, not for me.
Absolutely.
So, I spent a lot of time in a counselor's chair. And I learned a lot about myself. And I had a mentor of mine, Terry Wardle, say to me, ministry is a series of ungrieved losses. And he's right. And I was terrible at grieving. If somebody leaves your church, right? Someone quits your business, some client leaves, and you're like, oh, no big deal. I didn't need them anyway. That's what the cynic says, right? You harden your heart. So I was of that view. And what I realized in that summer of 2006, going right back to my childhood, is no, you actually feel that stuff and it bottles up. And sometimes it comes out as rage. Sometimes it comes out as anger. Sometimes it comes out as depression. Sometimes it comes out as despair. And so I had to go through decades of just grieving in the course of about a month and it still wells up from time to time where it's like, oh, I wonder what that is. But the scripture has a very helpful view of grieving. For example, if you look at the Old Testament, when Moses died, the people of Israel grieved for 40 days and 40 nights. And I read that for years and I thought, what is wrong with those people? Like, if the funeral's at noon, go to work at 2. Like, just, have those little triangle sandwiches, be back at the office at 2:00. What's wrong with you people? We don't do a good job of grieving. And I stunk at it. So even when I was, writing this book earlier this year, I'd asked someone to write the foreword. You'll notice if you get the book, there's no foreword to the book. And this is how it happened. I asked 2 people to write the foreword. They're good friends. And they said they were too busy to do it. Well, I was like devastated. And part of me, I wasn't focusing anymore. And I'm like, what is that? What is that? I'm still not good as a guy at naming my emotions, but I've had, I've spent thousands of dollars on counseling. So I went back to it and I thought, oh, I know. I'm disappointed. I feel rejected. I'm sad. And I didn't cry over it, but I processed it, got up, walked around, prayed about it. And by noon, I was refocused on work. You know what I just did? I just grieved that loss. And otherwise it would have gone under. And the next time I saw that person, I'll see both those people this month. There's no ill will. They were just really busy doing their own stuff. And we'll be able to high five each other and hang out, and we have a great friendship. Like, so there's no problem with that. They've both gone on to become great supporters of the book. But, I have to deal with that stuff. So I grieve my losses. I slept. It took me about 3 or 4 months to get back to what I would call 70% of normal. Within a year, I was maybe 80% of normal. But it took 5 years for me to really get to the point, from the time I burned out to the point where I felt like, okay, I am no longer in recovery. That was about 5 years. Now, maybe you can do it a lot faster if you're burning out. But I realized in the process, and this was the key for me, the deep desire that we all have is to get back to normal. It's like, I just want my life back to normal. But by the grace of God, I realized that normal got me to burnout. And if I went back to normal, my old normal, burnout was right around the corner. Like, what was it going to be? 41, 42? I burned out again. 43, 44. How old do I have to be before I totally burn out? And so what I became obsessed with, and this is a big part of the book too, is I said, I got to find a new normal. I got to figure this out. Like, because normal got me burned out. So what is my new normal? And so the antidote to burnout for me over the last decade is best summed up by the single line. I've got to live today in a way that will help me thrive tomorrow. That's it. I just got to live today in a way that will help me thrive tomorrow. And I think about that in terms of 5 categories. Spiritually, how's my relationship with God? Emotionally, how am I doing on the inside? Am I processing things healthily? Relationally, financially, and physically. I had ignored my physical health, so I've been in much better health over the last decade. Relationally, you can easily, as a leader, as an entrepreneur, be in draining relationships where you're always giving. In ministry, you're counseling people, you're trying to help people through their pain, but you should have an equal number of energizing relationships in your life. The kind of people that when you're with them, you're like, how did 5 hours just disappear? I thought we've been together for 5 minutes. Because you've got way too many meetings that are the other way around, where it's 5 minutes, but it felt like 5 hours. Yeah. Right? You need to compensate that. Financially, living with margin. Physically, I become a sleep Nazi. I have a sleep app. I try to get 7 to 8 hours every night. I take naps now. I become a nap evangelist. But I feel great. And if those five things are balanced in my life, and the reason I put today in is we always say, no, this is just a season, right? Like, I'm launching a book right now today as we're having this interview. I actually felt great. I took time off on the weekend. I went boating with one of my sons. I went for bike rides. I did about 100 kilometers of biking. Now, I worked and I went to church and I was part of it. But the thing is, you can always say, well, I'm just launching a book. Yeah, but after I'm launching a book, then I'm writing my next book. Or I've got this series coming up. Or I got a peak travel season coming up. My team knows I'm not booking red-eye flights. Like, you have to get my particular permission to book a red-eye flight. And if it costs a little bit more money to fly during the day, during business hours, then so be it. But I've realized that every time I've cheated that in my first 40 years of life, I've paid a disproportionate price. So it's not being a prima donna or a diva, but you've just got to learn for you and for your rhythms, the way God created you, how can you live today in a way that will help you thrive tomorrow, not just survive. So I haven't always got it right over the last decade, but that has been my song day after day, season after season. And I find that if I start running up a very small deficit, like let's say I'm like, man, I'm just tired. It's like, I've got to be able to get to the end of that quickly so that I can get back to the point. Usually it's a 24-hour turnaround where if I have that one pause day, I'm like, I'm back. That's good. Because when you burn out, you take 24 hours off, you're not back at hour 23. You might be back at month 3, month 8, year 3. I don't want to go through that again. And I don't want people to go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you that, and you hit on it a little bit, but how are you purposeful about that? Because it's easy, because you talked about the old normal and getting into the new normal, which means there's got to be some change and a little bit of discipline there. So like on a daily basis, what are a couple things like you do purposefully to make sure you don't get into those old ruts and you stay on track?
My reconstruction was a lot of counseling and then a lot of coaching, just leadership coaching, because it's not all the interior journey. I was just not very good at scale as a leader. So I had to learn to stop trying to run everything myself. A lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business people run into that, where you're just spending all day making decisions, and I had to really empower a team. That got us through the 1,000 barrier at our church. It's helping my company grow now that does, the blog, the podcast, and everything. I just have to make fewer and fewer decisions. So that was a big part of it. Some of it was I moved to a fixed calendar. I teach this in a course I offer called the High Impact Leader. And in the High Impact Leader, I kind of outline in detail, but I'll give you the nutshell of it, where I moved to a fixed calendar. I realized in my reconstruction that my important priorities in my life really happen in repeated patterns. And so I try to get up at the same time every day. I spend my first hour with God, and then I try to book no appointments prior to 10 or 11 a.m. on a weekday. I have 2 days a week that I set aside as no-fly zones, no meetings, no nothing, because the most important thing I bring to my work is my energy and my creativity. And I find that actually needs real time to develop and grow. And so I have to be very determined to carve that time out, because I could fill 70 hours a week with meetings and other people's demands. Another thing would be to schedule to my priorities. So I have a fixed schedule that is pretty much the same every week. Sunday is preaching, and then the afternoon is free. Saturday is a day off. Friday is a no meeting zone. Tuesday, we're trying to make now a no-fly zone as things get busier. No meetings on Tuesday. I try to do all my meetings on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And even then, I try to restrict that to a half day of meetings, because I know for myself, with what I'm called to do, I need to spend at least 50% of my time not in meetings to be able to produce content, preach sermons, connect with people, build into my team, plan for the future. So everybody will have a different formula. Right. But that's been really, really important to me. And then getting some hobbies that take me away from work, because workaholism runs in my blood. And so I picked 3 Bs. I didn't really have any hobbies in my 30s, which really is a bad way to live life. And so I have 3 Bs: bicycling, boating, and barbecue. I have a big green egg in my backyard. I use it almost every day. We have a boat that we live right across the street from a lake, so we're out on the boat a lot. And then I cycle because it's the only form of exercise I actually like. So those are things that have really helped. So those have been some habits, rituals, and disciplines that are just really important. And I found my 30s was kind of all chaos. And I did this while my kids were still at home. They're gone now. They're in university and out into life. But you can do that when you have kids. You can create little margins, little space in your life, and repeated routines. And I learned the power of saying no. I joke with my team all the time that most of their job is just saying no nicely all day, because if you have most of your leaders who are listening can relate to this, John, you will always have more opportunities than you have time. Yeah. And if you're not careful, you will be living your life according to other people's priorities, not yours. So I had to learn that on the leadership level. I also had to learn my emotional and personal and spiritual rhythms. And when I put that all together, that's where I got the reconstruction from.
I like that. I mean, I think you really could sum that up, and it's just taking the time to sit down and really meditate on the word, but just asking, like, what is me? What do I like? What I don't like? What works? I mean, it's really just taking the time, because I think a lot of us get so busy in those. I don't even know what a 40-hour work week looks like. I laugh when people say, "Oh my gosh, I work 4." I'm like, I've worked probably 70 hours most of my life, and because like you, I'm a workaholic. I enjoy it, but the thing is, it's not healthy, and it's taking the time for us personally to know what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think everybody's got a number too, and I think most people who do their own thing end up working more than 40 hours a week. But I figured out my number; it's 55. If I move beyond 55 hours a week, I start to get into that red zone, that danger zone, and that doesn't sound like a lot, like in entrepreneur circles. But I think there is if you look scripturally at the rhythm of life, we're supposed to spend about a third of our life sleeping. In addition to that, a seventh of our life resting. And then God throws in a whole lot of feast days and celebration days on top of that. And I think the more that I live my life according to the natural rhythms that I have, the better I do. And I also find if I show up rested, I can create, let's say I have a 2,000 word article to write. Well, that might take me 2 hours as opposed to 2 days if I'm exhausted, because my brain doesn't work when I'm tired. So whatever you have to do. And some people, the number is 70. Some people, the number is 50. Some it's 60, 65. I'd say 55 to 60 is sort of my ideal max. If I'm under 50 hours a week, I get really bored really fast. So that's sort of my zone. And
that's
it works
cool
for me.
I'm going to keep that in mind. That's actually really good advice. Okay. Going to skip a lot of questions as we wrap up the show. One that I never skip, and I do want to ask you, if you could go back to the younger you, Carey, you're going to pick an age. You're going to give yourself advice. You can't change anything, obviously, in the future, but you're going to just give yourself a motivational pep talk. What age would you go back to, and what advice would you give yourself?
I'd probably go back to 31, and I would say, listen to your wife. It's not her. It's you.
That's awesome.
That's what I would say to myself, because I spent too much of my time. Our marriage went through a rough season. We've been 28 years together. We absolutely love each other. She's my best friend, but it hasn't been easy. It's been worth it.
Yeah.
And when things started to go off the rails, I was convinced it was 100% her. She was convinced it was 100% me. So I go and talk to 31-year-old Carey and say, you idiot, it's you.
Yeah, that's good advice. So we just celebrated our 20th year.
Hey, congrats, John.
Thank you. Our first, I joke, I say this last 10 has been our honeymoon. The first 10 was hell. And because we were young and we were learning, like we both came from broken families, we didn't understand what it looked like to have to be married and to work through stuff. But the advice, if you're listening, whether you're thinking about getting married or you're married, just learning to love again and to listen to each other and be willing to take criticism and just work on ourselves, because our spouse always needs something from us that we're probably not meeting. And we're just not listening. And for some of us, myself, are hard-headed and think, like you said, well, it's not me, it's them. And it's us. So, and men, I'm going to save you years. Yeah, thank you. And we're saving men. I'm just telling you right now, Carey's advice is going to save you 10 years of heartache if you'll just take it.
Mm-hmm. And lots of money in counseling too. Like that was free.
Yes.
So there you go.
That was free. Okay. So, parting thoughts, Carey, as we wrap up, two things. Where do we find you? So I want to know more about where we find your book, if we want to have you as a speaker or even listen to your podcast as well.
Yeah, well, one easy way to get to it, it's a lot easier if you spell my name or an approximation of it, you'll find me. But go to didn'tseeitcomingbook.com. That lives right on my site. It's the portal into everything, didn'tseeitcomingbook.com. We'll get you there. And then I'm on all the socials, either C. Nieuwhof, Nieuwhof, or Carey Nieuwhof, Carey. I know it's a tough name, Dutch background, but anyway, that's where we can find it. Parting shot, hope is this. I hope the book, Didn't See It Coming, feels like hope to you, and I hope it feels like help to you. Because once you're cynical, you don't have to stay cynical. Once you're burned out, you don't need to stay burned out. Once you feel empty, that's a problem for a lot of leaders, is the emptiness of success. It's like, this company is bigger than I ever thought. Why do I feel so empty inside? That was all the lawyers I worked with in Toronto. It doesn't have to be that way. So we address 7 of the biggest challenges that kind of no one expects, everyone experiences. And I hope that feels like hope and help to you if you get a chance to look at the book.
Amen to that. Thank you so much. So I forgot to tell our listeners on past shows, this specific publisher that Carey's involved with, if you will email us, we always send out 5 copies. So for the first 5 people that will send me their email address, get on Facebook and like us, and send me a Facebook message. My wife will take your information, and we will send you a free book that Carey just wrote. So do not forget to do that.
Pretty sweet.
Yeah, it's really sweet. And actually, you'd be surprised. We get hundreds of thousands of downloads, and only a handful of people will actually take the time because they just assume, oh, well, somebody else did it. And believe it or not, 5 books, it'll take a week sometimes for people to send them in. But recently, I think that actually happened in the first day. But it's really surprising to me.
Well, cool. I'm glad you do that.
Yeah.
And Waterbrook's a great publisher. Waterbrook Penguin has been wonderful in partnering with this book. So nice of them to do that.
They've been great. All right, Carey, I just want to hold on just a second, but I just want to tell you thank you so much for your story and obviously your life journey of what you've been through and sharing that with us. And hopefully saving us thousands of dollars of counseling and years of heartache.
Hey, it's my pleasure. John, thanks for what you do. I really appreciate you and your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hold on just a second. Roar Nation, thank you guys. I hope you love that. I hope it inspires you. I highly recommend grabbing the book. I think at some point in life, if you haven't experienced burnout, you're probably on the way to burnout. I've been there twice, and it's a hard road to hoe sometimes, so this will definitely help you along your way. Don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes. Jump on and send us a message. We love to hear from you. We love you guys. Remember, be real, be authentic, and be you. God bless.
That's all for this episode of Are You Real? Finding the Authentic You. Be sure to go to areyoureal.org for your free questionnaire to identify your gifts and talents and how you can use them to help people become leaders and catapult them into their destiny to help others become the leaders of tomorrow. We appreciate you spending your time with us and look forward to helping you reach out and revolutionize next time on Are You Real? Finding the Authentic You.